Have you ever stopped to think that the Bible, in addition to being a sacred book full of wisdom, also contains stories so unusual that they would make any Hollywood screenwriter lose sleep? Yes, among the parables of love and faith, there are curious biblical passages, visions that seem straight out of fiction films, and shocking events that almost no one talks about. Most impressively, each of these strange stories from the Bible carries a purpose, whether it's a divine warning, a moral lesson, or a prophetic symbol of something much greater. There are things there that make your head spin: bronze serpents that heal, prophets walking around naked for years, bread baked on feces, yes, you read that right, and even donkeys that talk like people. And no, this is not an exaggeration or a joke. These are real accounts, preserved for centuries, that defy logic and at the same time point to profound spiritual truths. It turns out that few people talk about it. Maybe out of fear, maybe because I don't know what to do with these little-known parts of the Bible. But today, the conversation will be different. Let's open this treasure chest of forgotten passages and face heed what they reveal about the power, divine justice, and supernatural signs that mark the history of God's people. If you think you've seen it all, get ready. What's coming will shatter any comfortable certainty. These divine revelations are crude, symbolic, and in many cases, even shocking. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content. And the most fascinating thing, each of these unlikely situations has an underlying message, often a living metaphor, enacted by the prophets of the Bible. They're like pieces of a spiritual puzzle that only fit together when we stop, reflect, and ask, what does this want to show me today? If you enjoy exploring outside the box themes and questioning the obvious, then you're in the right place. So take a deep breath, open your mind, and hold on to your faith, because what you discover now could change the way you see the Bible forever. And after all, maybe the strange isn't so strange after all. It's just waiting to be revealed in a new way. Right away, one of the most curious biblical passages appears in the desert, when the people of Israel are arguing with God because of the tiring journey. In response, poisonous snakes appear, direct and blunt divine punishment. It's one of those shocking events in the Bible that leaves us speechless. People begin to die and panic spreads. But that's where one of the strangest solutions ever recorded comes in a bronze serpent on a pole. Yes, an image of serpent, a symbol of evil since Gene's Isis, now used as an instrument of healing. God tells Moses to make the sculpture and raise it high for everyone to see. Whoever was bitten and looked at the bronze serpent would be healed instantly. Does it sound like a movie script? It seems. But it is one of the unusual miracles that show how God can act in unconventional ways. The symbol here breaks expectations and provokes reflection. This little-known part of the Bible forces us to look beyond the literal. The bronze serpent had no powers in itself. She was a supernatural sign, a channel to activate the people's faith. It was as if God said, you're going to have to trust, even if you don't understand. And between you and me, how many times in our lives do we need to do exactly that? Follow even without apparent logic. Faith is not always rational, and the Bible loves to remind us of that. Now, think about the impact of this visually: a bunch of sick people crawling the desert, looking up for salvation in a strange object. Is it or isn't a powerful image? A true biblical vision that screams symbolism on all sides. What's more, this episode echoes centuries later, when Jesus compares himself to this raised serpent. John 3:14. The cross, in the end, becomes the new bronze pole. In other words, what seemed like just another bizarre story among so many strange stories in the Bible turns into a biblical prophecy in disguise. God was already pointing to something bigger long before the people understood. And let's face it, this mysterious and sometimes disconcerting way of acting is very characteristic of him. He uses the improbable, uses the ugly, even use a snake if necessary. We just need to pay attention to the signs. So the next time you come across something that seems completely meaningless in life or in your own reading of the Bible, take a deep breath. Remember the bronze serpent. Sometimes what seems absurd is precisely what will heal. And maybe, like then, we just need to lift our eyes and see what God is showing us, even if it's in a strange way. This is one of those biblical passages that makes us stop and reread to make sure we understand. A prophet of God, obedient to a certain point, ends up killed by a lion, but the detail is what is shocking: the animal does not destroy the body or touch the donkey that was with him. Strange? Very. This scene carries a symbolic and silent weight that is difficult to ignore. It's one of those strange stories from the Bible that seems like dark poetry. The context helps. God gives a clear order to the prophet: go, deliver the message, and do not return the same way or eat or drink there. The problem begins when another man, who also claims to be a prophet, deceives him with a revelation supposedly coming from an angel. Result? The first prophet disobeys and pays with his own life. We see here not only an example of divine justice, but also a warning about spiritual dissonance. The most curious thing about this narrative is the lion's behavior. It attacks, but does not devour. He kills, but then stands there as if guarding the body. A biblical symbol loaded with meaning. The lion becomes more than an instrument of judgment. He is a witness to the seriousness of the divine calling. God didn't need to shout. It was enough to leave that scene exposed, with a three-bodied donkey and lion motionless, in a kind of living monument to obedience. It's like silent preaching along the way. There was no thunder, no earthquake, no collective punishment. Just a body, a donkey, and a lion. Simple, direct, and deeply unsettling. These supernatural signs reveal much more than they seem. Sometimes God speaks with the force of a roar, others with the strangeness of a silence full of meanings. And let's face it, this affects anyone who takes faith seriously. This bizarre event also serves as a warning to those who are confusing God's voice with any beautiful sensation or speech. It's not enough to appear spiritual. It has to be rooted in what God has actually commanded. This prophet did not fall because he was malicious, but because he was naive. And that lesson still resonates today. Not all prophecy is true prophecy. This is why knowing the Bible deeply is essential. So the next time you hear someone saying God revealed it to me, think about this lion. Sometimes judgment comes not because of what we openly did wrong, but because of what we failed to check carefully. One of the most little-known parts of the Bible, yes, but with a huge lesson about spiritual responsibility. And look, this is just the beginning. There's still a lot more weird things out there. This one is one of those passages that is so heavy that many people prefer not to comment. During the siege of Samaria, hunger reached such an absurd point that two women made an unimaginable agreement to cook and eat their own children. That's right, and the worst part, one of them fulfills the deal. It is one of the most shocking events in the Bible, a raw portrait of human degradation in times of utter despair. The king of Israel, upon hearing this report, tears his clothes as a sign of mourning, and who can blame him? It's as if humanity has completely lost itself. This scene is not just an extreme account. It is a biblical symbol of the consequence of turning away from God. The people were immersed in idolatry and injustice, and now they were reaping the bitter fruits. It is what the Bible calls divine punishment, but with pain that is almost unbearable to witness. In this story, what screams most is not the act itself, but the collapse of morals. When a mother reaches this point, it is because all limits have already been crossed. Physical hunger reveals the spiritual hunger that plagued those people. In normal times, this would be unthinkable, but the Bible is too honest to hide what happens when faith is exchanged for self-reliance. And this text is a harsh but necessary mirror. You may even think, but what does this have to do with me today? Oh, because this story exposes human nature when it moves away from divine principles. We're not just talking about a hunger for bread, we're talking about a hunger for justice, for purpose, for direction. The Bible is full of prophecies and visions that warn about exactly this. Without a spiritual foundation, everything falls apart. And sometimes, the breakdown starts at home. It is one of those little-known parts of the Bible that shed light on deep themes, even if in a crude way, because behind the horror, there is a call for collective responsibility. Where were the leaders? Where were the prophets? When a society reaches this point, it is because many people were silent before. This passage is an open wound that still pulses and asks us to reflect on our role in the world. And even in the midst of chaos, the Bible does not abandon hope. This extreme hunger precedes a miracle, the liberation of Samaria, in the following chapter. In other words, the darkest valley could be the prelude to the turning point. But this turning point only happens when one recognizes total bankruptcy and turns to God. Is it shocking? But it's also revealing, because rock bottom is sometimes the only place you can look up. This is, without a doubt, one of the most disconcerting biblical passages of all. God tells the prophet Isaiah to take off his clothes and walk around naked, that's right, completely naked for 3 years straight. Now imagine this today, a respected man, known as God's spokesman, walking the streets like this. It sounds crazy, but it was a biblical symbol with a clear purpose. God wanted to shock the people, and he succeeded. The order had a reason. It was a prophetic scenario to show what would happen to Egypt and Ethiopia, nations in which the people of Judah were placing trust. In other words, the people preferred political alliances than depending on the Lord. Isaiah became a living prophecy, or rather, a walking supernatural sign. The prophet's embarrassment reflected the shame that would befall these nations when they were taken captive. This type of event, strange as it may seem, was not uncommon among the prophets of the Bible. Many of them experienced extreme symbolic acts. And why? Because sometimes the only way to break through spiritual apathy is to shock. God used the prophet as a living billboard, and with Isaiah, it was no different. The discomfort was intentional. It was a stark warning to anyone who would listen or see. Now think about the personal cost of this. 3 years of being looked at, judged, maybe even ridiculed. Isaiah was willing to lose his reputation by obedience. And here comes a valuable lesson. Following a calling is not always comfortable. Sometimes it's embarrassing, lonely, unglamorous. This is one of those little-known parts of the Bible that talks more about courage than madness. The amazing thing is that the message worked. Centuries later, the Bible records that the kingdoms trusted in themselves and fell exactly as God had warned through that symbolic act. In other words, what seemed like just another bizarre thing became a confirmed biblical prophecy. Sometimes today's ridiculousness is tomorrow's revealed truth, and Isaiah had to pay for it with his own body. So when you feel uncomfortable following your faith in a world that mocks spiritual principles, remember naked Isaiah. God can, yes, ask for things that no one understands at the moment, but he always has a plan, and the discomfort now could be exactly the sign that you are on the right path. And the next step on this journey? Well, get ready, there are more stomach-turning biblical stories to come. If you think the Bible is all serious and only has formal teachings, this one will surprise you. In Numbers 22, we find one of the most curious biblical passages of all time, a donkey that literally opens its mouth and speaks to its owner. That's right, a conversation between a prophet and his animal. It looks like something out of a cartoon, but it's one of the unusual miracles that God used to shake Balaam up. The context? Balaam was hired by an enemy king to curse Israel. But God didn't like this story. And as Balaam insisted on the wrong path, God sent an angel to block him. But the prophet did not see the angel. What he saw was a donkey. And she tried to protect the owner by dodging the angel 3 times until she was beaten for it. That's when the unexpected happened. The donkey became God's spokesperson. And it's not just the fact that she talks, it's the way what she says. She complains, argues, asks, "What did I do to you to hit me 3 times?" It's hilarious and profound at the same time. An animal, normally seen as stubborn, gives a lesson in spiritual sensitivity to a prophet blinded by interests. This is one of those strange stories from the Bible that carry powerful lessons disguised as bizarreness. More than humor, this episode is full of biblical symbolism. The donkey represents that which seems insignificant, but that God can use powerfully. The prophet, on the other hand, symbolizes someone who is so busy with their own plans that they do not notice the supernatural signs around them. And let's agree, how many times are we like Balaam? Big head, insistent, and still angry with those who try to help us. This event shows how God speaks in unexpected ways. Sometimes he uses a soft voice, others a tragedy, and in some moments, even a donkey. The important thing is to be sensitive. Prophets in the Bible knew this, even if, like Balaam, they didn't always get it right the first time. The point is, if God wants to reach you, he will use whatever it takes. And the unlikely could be the perfect channel. So the next time you feel like a strange message is trying to warn you, don't ignore it. It could be the message that will save your journey. And if even a donkey was an instrument of divine revelations, Who are you to doubt the means? The Bible is full of these funny yet profound reminders. And look, there's still a lot more to come. This is one of those passages that makes the reader frown and think, did I read that right? Yes, you read it. God tells the prophet Ezekiel to cook bread using human feces as fuel. It seems surreal, but it is in the Bible and with a very clear purpose. The idea was to show, in a dramatic way, the impurity that would come upon the people of Israel during the exile. Ezekiel became a living symbol, or rather, a walking protest. At the time, the prophet even tries to reason with God. He says he always tried to stay pure and that would be too heavy. And in an unexpected twist, God accepts the appeal and exchanges human feces for cow dung. Has it improved? A little, but still, it remains one of the unusual miracles that only the Bible presents. And the lesson remains, sometimes a message needs to be scandalous to be heard. This prophetic performance was not just bizarre theater. She was full of meaning. Bread, which is normally a symbol of sustenance and communion, took on tones of misery and shame. It was a living metaphor about the broken relationship with God. The prophets of the Bible often use their own bodies and routines to communicate profound messages, and Ezekiel was a master at this. The people, upon seeing that scene, were certainly shocked. And that was the goal. God was tired of ignored warnings. So he decided to use what today we would call impactful visual language. It's as if he said, if you don't hear with your ears, let's see with your eyes. Among all the little-known parts of the Bible, this is one of the most provocative. Ezekiel, despite obeying, did not stop questioning. And this shows that faith is not blind submission, but trust with dialogue. He didn't disobey, but he also didn't swallow everything in silence. And the most beautiful thing, God listened. The Lord is not after spiritual robots, but conscious servants. And this teaches us that even in the strangest of orders, we can talk to Creator. That in itself is already a miracle. Ultimately, this episode is more than a visual shock. It's a prophetic indictment with lessons still valid today. How far are we willing to go to communicate a truth? Aren't we trying to soften too much messages that need to be tough? These curious biblical passages remind us that sometimes God's path passes through uncomfortable terrain. And the next one, he is even more unexpected. If there's something Jesus did like no one else, it was breaking patterns. While religious people followed rigid formulas, he surprised with actions that confused even the wisest. A classic example is in these curious biblical passages where Jesus heals using saliva and clay. It may seem strange, and it is, but like every story in the Bible, this has a much greater meaning than the initial bizarreness suggests. Imagine seeing the Son of God, the expected Messiah, spits on the ground, makes mud with the earth, and smears it across the eyes of a blind man. If it were today, it would become a meme, a viral video, a controversial headline. But at that time, the gesture carried deep biblical symbolism. The earth represents creation, saliva, the breath of life. Jesus was, in effect, recreating man's vision as the Creator did in the beginning from the dust. These unusual miracles are not just demonstrations of power. They are layered supernatural signs. By healing in such an unconventional way, Jesus showed that spiritual healing also requires steps outside the obvious. Sometimes transformation comes not through traditional methods, but through unexpected actions. And raised the key the blind man obeyed, went to wash and came back seeing. Miracle faith result. These little-known parts of the Bible teach us something valuable. God does not always act the way we expect. Sometimes the answer to prayer comes with a cry in the face, literally or figuratively. The question is, do you trust enough to let God have his way? The lesson of these accounts is not just in the miracle, but in the willingness to undergo processes that seem strange. Many people today seek healing, emotional, spiritual, physical, but reject anything that is outside the ordinary. But the Bible is clear. Biblical prophecies, miracles, and divine revelations almost always break human logic. It was like that with the clay of Jesus, a simple, apparently rude act that carried the power of heaven. And the question remains, are we willing to get a little dirty to really see? Jesus did not use standardized methods. He used what was at hand, and in doing so, he made it clear that power is not in the middle, but in the source. And when the source is divine, Even clay becomes an instrument of life. So the next time the answer seems strange, remember God has infinite creativity. And if spittle and clay can cure blindness, what else can he do with that which you despise? Among the shocking events in the Bible, this one looks like a scene from an action movie. Samson, one of Israel's most iconic judges, finds himself surrounded by 1,000 Philistine enemies. No sword, no army, no armor. He looks around, sees a donkey carcass, takes the animal's jaw, and with that, kills 1,000 men. Yes, 1,000. It's almost unbelievable, Anne, yet it's recorded in detail in the book of Judges. This episode is a clear portrait of how God uses unlikely instruments to accomplish great things. Samson was not a conventional hero. He was impulsive, sometimes contradictory, but he carried a gift of supernatural strength granted directly by God. The donkey's jaw then becomes a symbol that when the Spirit of the Lord manifests itself, any object becomes a powerful weapon. The scene, as brutal as it may seem, is loaded with meaning. It speaks of divine justice. Samson was fighting back against betrayals and oppression, but he also carries the weight of the loneliness of the Bible's prophets. He fought alone, guided by a calling that not even he fully understood. The Bible does not mask violence, it inserts it into context where the divine confronts human chaos. And see how the unusual miracles appear. It is not just Samson's strength that impresses, but the fact that victory came through something completely unexpected. It's as if God said, "You don't need what you think is essential. You just need me." This breaks human logic and shows that in the right hands, even old bone can become a tool for redemption. Furthermore, there's a subtle humor in this passage. After winning, Samson makes a pun on the word donkey in Hebrew, as if he were laughing at the irony of the situation. The Bible, with all its seriousness, does not lose its human tone. These curious details and little-known parts of the Bible make fascinating reading. They are hints of reality in the midst of spirituality. And if you feel disarmed in the face of live struggles, remember Samson and his jawbone. Maybe what you need to win is already there, right before your eyes, as strange as it may seem. And God, once again, shows that he does not act by logic, but by faith. And in the next episode, we'll see how even mockery against a prophet can end in a not-so-funny way. This passage is one of the most disconcerting in the Bible, and for good reason. Elisha, Elijah's successor, was beginning his prophetic ministry when a group of young men began mocking him. Shouting, "Come up, you bald head," in a mocking tone. The prophet's reaction? He curses them in the name of the Lord. Result? 2 bears come out of the woods and tear 42 of these young men to pieces. Is it or isn't it one of those shocking events in the Bible that leaves us speechless? First of all, it is important to understand that the story goes far beyond personal revenge. It is deeply linked to the idea of divine justice and respect for spiritual authorities. In Hebrew culture, to mock a prophet was to mock the very God who sent him. And Elisha wasn't just anyone. He had just assumed the mantle of Elijah, heavy biblical symbol, full of power and responsibility. The number of young people involved, 42, and nature's immediate reaction reveal that this was not just a severe punishment. It was a supernatural sign, one of the curious biblical passages that show how God manifests himself in a radical way in defense of his own. It's almost like a warning: be careful, with a reverence. It's not about fear, it's about reverence. A fine line that human beings often cross without realizing it. This episode also reveals something about the prophets of the Bible. They were not just figures of comfort and hope. They were also bearers of judgment. And this confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. The same God who heals with spit and clay can also allow bears to teach respect. Is it strange? Very, but also deeply symbolic. The Bible does not hide the severity of the divine when necessary. Of course, today we may find all this exaggerated. After all, who has never made fun of someone? But the text invites us to reflect on the value of honor, something increasingly rare. How many times does mockery become a habit, disguised as a joke? This little-known part of the Bible reminds us that words have weight and that laughing at the wrong thing can be costly, sometimes literally. And if even the bears were God's instruments in this story, what else can he use to teach, correct, and protect? These biblical symbols are not to scare us, but to open our eyes. In the next story, interestingly enough, involves bones dry, lifeless, that suddenly begin to move. One of the most powerful biblical visions ever recorded. Ezekiel's vision of dry bones is one of the most powerful images in the Bible. In a desolate field, the prophet sees a vast army of bones scattered across the ground, dead, lifeless, hopeless. God asks Ezekiel to prophesy about those bones, and against all logic, he begins to hear the sound of bones coming together, tendons forming, and finally, an entire army of living people emerges. This is one of the curious biblical passages that, despite being frightening, carry deeply hopeful symbolism. Here, what seemed like a scene of utter desolation turns into an extraordinary miracle. The dry bones represent the nation of Israel, which was spiritually dead in exile, without strength and direction. Ezekiel is called to announce that, just as those bones came back to life, God's people would also be restored. And the most incredible thing is that this vision speaks not only to people of Israel, but also to us today about restoration and spiritual rebirth. This episode is a clear example of biblical visions that not only communicate the present, but also point to the future. He teaches that when it seems like all is lost, the power of God can bring life where there was only despair before. Dry bones are a symbol of our own situation, often without strength or hope. But just as God breathed life into Ezekiel's bones, he can also breathe new life into our most difficult circumstances. Ezekiel not only sees the bones rising again, but hears the sound of the miracle happening. The Bible, in many of these strange stories, uses sounds and images to illustrate divine power in unique ways. In this case, the sound of the bones coming together and transforming into a living army is like an alarm to us. God's restoration is neither silent nor passive. It is a vibrant, intense, and action-packed process. This event also talks about the divine justice. What was fragmented and abandoned was restored by the power of God. And the message is clear: transformation does not depend on the external situation, but on the internal power that God can generate at any moment. Israel, after so many years of desolation, was called to rise again. And we, in moments of hopelessness, can also find renewal through faith. This vision of Ezekiel also carries powerful symbolism about the biblical prophecies. When God speaks, he doesn't just predict the future, he shapes it. The miracle of restoration is not something that will come from a distant place, but something that is already underway, waiting for our collaboration with the Word. Just as the bones heard God's voice and rose up, our lives also respond to divine action. It is a lesson that, even in situations of apparent death, God's voice can bring new life. This story is more like a Thursday night action drama than a traditional sermon. During one of Paul's missionary journeys, he was preaching for hours on end. It was a hot and stuffy night, and a young man named Eutycho, who was sitting at the window to try to beat the heat, ended up falling asleep. What happens next is pure adrenaline. The young man falls from the third floor and dies instantly. Paul, with the calm that only an apostle can have, runs down and resurrects him. If that is an unusual miracle, I don't know what else is. What stands out here is Paul's immediate and almost casual response. In the midst of an imminent death situation, he simply says, "Do not be alarmed, he is alive." This isn't something we see every day, right? Normally, it would be total panic. But Paul, filled with the authority of the Spirit, is certain that the situation is not the end. And this teaches us a very important lesson about faith. When it seems like everything is over, God can intervene in surprising ways. This event, which at first glance may seem like a simple anecdote about accidents and resurrections, carries a message of trusting God's power over life and death. Eutychus' death was not an end point, but an opportunity for God's presence to be highlighted once again. And by being resurrected, the young man was not only a testimony of Paul's authority, but also a reminder that death with God does not have the last word. Furthermore, this passage makes us reflect on the nature of biblical prophecies and miracles. They often happen in ordinary contexts. We are not talking about a resurrection in an atmosphere of pure spirituality. No, here, the death occurs at a seemingly ordinary moment during a long meeting, and that is fundamental. God acts in everyday life, in the midst of our most tiring routine, showing that he is not restricted to holy places or special moments. It can act in any window at any time. Another interesting point is the contrast between Paolo's reaction and the reaction of others present. While people around him were in shock, Paolo remained calm and did what seemed impossible. This episode challenges us in moments of chaos. How do we react? What this story teaches us is that our faith cannot be shaken by external circumstances. When God's power manifests, even natural laws bend His will. Ultimately, this miracle leads us to think about the biblical visions and miracles that happen in the midst of normality. Like that young man who fell out a window, many of us are on the verge of falling in our lives, whether out of frustration, exhaustion, or loss. But like the young man in Acts, we can be raised up again, restored, when we get the attention of the resurrecting God. Sometimes a fall is not the end. She is just the beginning of something new. This story is breathtaking. King Hezekiah of Judah was faced with a desperate situation. The Assyrian army, under the command of Sennacherib, had surrounded Jerusalem and seemed ready to destroy everything. Hezekiah, in an act of faith, prays to God and asks for protection. The divine response comes in a shocking way. In a single night, an angel of the Lord kills 185,000 Syrian soldiers. It's not a scene from a war movie. It's one of the most impressive demonstrations of God's power in the Bible. This supernatural action, involving a single angel, shows how vast and incomprehensible God's power is. What seems impossible to human beings, like destroying an entire army in one night, is just one of the amazing things God does. God does not depend on large numbers of soldiers or human strategies. He can change the course of history with just one divine intervention, even using angels as instruments His will. What does this story teach us about divine justice? First, God does not act impulsively, but with a purpose. The Assyrian army had attacked several nations, and their attitudes were full of arrogance and disrespect. The destruction that came upon them was not random, but a response to violence and abuse of power. This passage reminds us that God is aware of injustices and that, in His time, justice will be served even in ways we cannot predict. But there is also a side to the story that is fascinating. Hezekiah's calm before the miracle happened. As the Assyrian army approached, Hezekiah did not resort to military strategies or alliances with other kings, but trusted fully in God. He sought divine guidance and rested in the promise that God would protect Jerusalem. This example of unwavering faith is something we can all learn from. When we are surrounded by problems, true strength lies in trusting that God is in control, no matter how great the battle. This episode is also a clear example of how supernatural signs work in the Bible. God did not use human armies, weapons, or warfare tactics. Instead, He chose an angel, a heavenly being, to act directly and efficiently. This makes us reflect how often are we so focused on natural methods that we forget the supernatural power that is at our disposal. God is not limited by human means, and His ways of acting are often much grander than we imagine. And lastly, this passage also challenges us to think about the reality of heavenly power. In a world where things happen so predictably and logically, stories like this remind us that there is so much more going on behind the scenes. What we see with our eyes is only a fraction of the truth. God is operating at levels that we often cannot see, but His intervention is constant, and that should give us hope, knowing that when we need it most, an angel could be the answer. This story is one of the most disturbing and fascinating we find in the Bible. King Ahab of Israel, in his desire to conquer Ramoth-Gilead, consults his prophets. They, in unison, affirm that victory will be theirs. However, the prophet Micaiah, defying everyone else, reveals a vision that overturns everything. A lying spirit was sent by God to deceive Ahab's prophets, leading him to imminent death. It's one of the most intriguing moments of biblical prophecies, where even spiritual figures are used to fulfill divine plans, even if this involves deception and tragedy. But what exactly does this story mean? At first, it may seem that God is allowing lies. However, it is important to understand that the main objective was to show human fallibility and how pride and the search for power can distort the truth. Ahab did not want to hear the word of God, but what confirmed his own beliefs and desires. By sending a lying spirit, God was, in effect, allowing Ahab to experience the consequences of his hardened heart and his refusal to hear the truth. The presence of lying spirit, it is a reminder that In our own times, we are not exempt from being led by wrong ideas. How often do we seek to confirm our own opinions instead of being open to the truth, even if it confronts us? Deception infiltrates not only spiritual matters, but also small, everyday decisions. This passage challenges us to reflect on our choices and question whether we are seeking what is right or just what we want to hear. Furthermore, this story is a warning about the divine punishment. Sometimes God's punishment does not come immediately or directly. It can be a process where the person begins to deceive themselves on their own. The lying spirit that enveloped Ahab's prophets was not an instant punishment, but God's way of allowing the king to go his own way. This also makes us wonder, could it be that by persisting in our error, God allows us to be blinded by the lie until the consequences finally reveal themselves? Another important lesson from this story is about the truth of biblical visions and how they can be distorted. What we saw with Ahab's prophets is not isolated. There are several biblical passages that speak of visions and prophecies being corrupted by external influences, whether human or spiritual. This brings us to an essential lesson. We must always test what we hear or see in the light of divine truth. The Word of God can never be based on pleasing others, but must be a pure source of wisdom. And finally, this story also teaches us about the role of celestial creatures. The lying spirit that was sent by God was no ordinary demon, but a spiritual being that, by its very nature, acted to fulfill the divine will. Although the concept of angels and spirits is often shrouded in mystery, here we see that even celestial beings can be used to accomplish divine purposes, even in difficult or perplexing situations. They are fully subject to the authority of God, who directs their actions for greater good, even if the results seem difficult to understand. This is one of those unusual details in the Bible that, at first glance, seems unnecessary, but which carries deep symbolism. During Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, a mysterious young man who was following disciples is grabbed by the soldiers. In a moment of desperation, he escapes capture, but not without leaving something behind his tunic. He runs away naked without even looking back. What is that? Why did this scene appear in one of the Gospels? This episode is one of the little-known parts of the Bible, and it is curiously enigmatic. The young man who runs away without a name and without an identity is possibly a representation of all those who abandon their faith or Christ himself in times of distress. He is a portrait of someone who, when the pressure increases, finds himself unable to face the consequences and, out of fear, decides to walk away, even in a humiliating way. The detail of running away naked is not accidental. It symbolizes the shame and loss of dignity that occurs when someone abandons their principles at the moment of test. But we can also look at this escape in a different way. After all, this escape can be a metaphor for our own struggle with shame and fear. How many times have we felt naked before God, with nothing to hide, and at the same time aware of our flaws? The young man running away is like many of us, who in times of crisis prefer to run away from responsibilities or difficult situations. This scene reminds us how, sometimes, our humanity leads us to choose the path of escape instead of courage and perseverance. Within the context of divine justice, it is interesting to note that although the young man fled, this does not mean that he was forgotten or condemned. God's justice is always just, but also merciful. There is no mention of judgment or punishment for the young man, which suggests that he merely represented a reflection of humanity in its moment of weakness. His escape did not nullify Christ's sacrifice. He may have fled, but that didn't stop Jesus' mission from moving forward. Furthermore, this passage places us before reflection on human nature in times of unusual miracles. Jesus' arrest, the moment of greatest distress and conflict, serves as the backdrop for this escape. And it is curious how this small detail is a reminder of how even disciples and those who were closest to Jesus could falter. Even in such an extraordinary moment, marked by signs and miracles, human weakness is evident. And finally, this story of escape is also an invitation to understand the concept of biblical visions and how they often manifest themselves in the most unexpected details. We must not only look at the big events, but at the small actions that, although they seem irrelevant, have their own meaning. The young man running away naked can be seen as a symbol of a human being in crisis, trying to hide his flaws, but at the same time, inviting us to reflect on our own reactions to temptation, fear, and loss of control. This passage in Revelation brings one of the most enigmatic and surprising images in the Bible, beings full of eyes all over their bodies. We are talking about the creatures that surround the throne of God, described by John in an apocalyptic vision. They are described as being full of eyes before and behind, which leads us to a reflection on total omniscience and divine surveillance. These beings not only observe everything, but also appear to be instruments of divine perception. It's as if God is saying, I see everything, every detail, every action. What do these creatures represent? Then, they are a manifestation of biblical symbols, powerful. Their vision full of eyes is a clear symbol of the perfection of divine vision, which sees and knows everything without fail. The eyes represent the deep and immeasurable knowledge that God has, not only of what we see, but also of everything that is hidden from our eyes. It is as if, through these creatures, spiritual truth was unveiled before us, reminding us of the infinity of God's understanding. Furthermore, this image is directly linked to the idea of supernatural signs. These beings are not mere angelic creatures. They have a clear and powerful mission to worship and glorify God in His entirety. They are a representation of how spiritual things, often mysterious to us, have a purpose and power far greater than we can understand. His presence in Revelation serves as a reminder that divine reality is much broader than our limited perception. In the context of Apocalypse, a book loaded with imagery and prophecy, these creatures with eyes everywhere represent God's ongoing surveillance over the cosmos. They remind us that God is not just on a heavenly throne, but that He is actively observing and interacting with the world. The presence of these creatures suggests that, even in the midst of the chaos and tribulation that Revelation describes, God remains in absolute control and nothing escapes His gaze. This vision of creatures full of eyes is also an invitation to introspection. If God sees everything, how can we hide anything from His presence? This is an idea that challenges our sense of privacy and control. However, rather than being a threat, this divine presence is a source of comfort. Knowing that God is attentive to everything gives us security, because it means that He takes care of every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. Finally, these eyed creatures in Revelation are a representation of the divine mystery and how God, in His infinite wisdom, reveals to us aspects of His nature that are unattainable to our finite mind. The Apocalypse is a book of revelations, and these creatures are a reflection of this constant revelation of God, which is never limited or hidden. They remind us that, although we often cannot understand everything, there's a greater truth being unveiled, and we are called to seek this understanding, trusting in God's watchful eye over us. Now that you've discovered these 15 strangest and most shocking passages in the Bible, it's time to reflect on what they really mean for your life. How have you interpreted the mysteries and signs that God leaves on your path? Is there something you have avoided facing or understanding? These stories challenge us to look at the world with new eyes, to understand that there is much more than we can see, and to trust in God's power even when situations seem incomprehensible. It's time to apply these teachings to your spiritual journey. Ask yourself, are you open to divine revelation, even when it comes in unexpected ways? Are you willing to face the mysteries of life with faith, courage, and curiosity? Don't be afraid to question. Seek more and delve deeper into biblical knowledge. The answers may come from where you least expect them. If you like this content, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Only then will you be aware of more incredible revelations like this. Remember, the Bible is full of secrets that can transform your life, and you are on the right path to discovering them. Until next time,